Hey, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is about almost noon, about 11:50 on Monday, May 17th, and I'm sitting down drinking my second cup of coffee, and I wanted just to share a few thoughts with you today regarding both what's going on with COVID-19 and the new guidance from the CDC, as well as the ongoing horror of what we're seeing in Palestine and in Gaza and in Jerusalem. And so I want to discuss both of those things this morning. But before we do, as I always start off, I just want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from Piscataway lands. And I want to honor and thank the Piscataway for being the stewards of these lands. I want to state how humbled I am to be living on these lands. And I want to acknowledge that the Piscataway are still here. And I am deeply honored to be living on these lands today. Before we start, let me share this quickly off on my Twitter so that people can join me from that recording as well. So let me just grab this really quick. So will take just a second. I'm getting better at jumping back and forth between these two, hopefully without getting too distracted. Okay, so let's start by talking about the CDC's new guidance. You'll notice that over the weekend, or late last week, I think the CDC basically came out and said that in most situations, people who have been fully vaccinated, which means they are 2 weeks past their Johnson & Johnson shot or 2 weeks past their second Pfizer or Moderna shot, can now stop masking. And they can essentially both indoors and outdoors, except for in certain situations, large crowds indoors, that people can stop wearing masks. And this resulted in a lot of locations and businesses dropping their mask mandates and basically saying we don't have to wear masks anymore. And this has led to both a lot of confusion as well as some frustration. Right, because, and this is, I'm just going to be honest with you. I've been paying attention not only to what we're doing here domestically, where we have about 37% of our population is fully vaccinated, and almost 47%, I think, has at least the first shot. So it's less than 50%. Nowhere near what we need for herd immunity. And the numbers of new vaccinations shots has been decreasing because largely everyone who wants a vaccine has been able to get one. And so now it's about persuading the people who are hesitant to get one, whether it's because of health reasons or access reasons, or they just don't want to get a vaccine, or they don't think COVID is real, which there is a number of people who believe that. And so they're not getting vaccinated, and many probably don't intend to get vaccinated. And so when I look at what the CDC recommended and what the White House began advocating for, which is we can rip off our masks and go maskless in work situations and dining and everything else. And yet I look outside, I look around the globe, and our numbers globally are at some of the highest they've been in the entire pandemic. The numbers of new infections daily, the numbers of deaths daily are at like the second highest level they've been in the entire pandemic. Only around December and January were they higher than what they are now. And there are many places like India where they're crazy numbers right now, and other places like even in the UK where different variants are increasing. And it's surprising to me, given how Joe Biden was so critical of the Trump administration, that he is now kind of opening up this door and he's treating this pandemic, this COVID-19, like it's a local epidemic instead of a global pandemic. And not acknowledging at all that there are a number of people, as we've seen from the protests and other ways, who they almost refused to wear masks even while there was, well, even before the CDC guidance. And now that we're doing this on the honor system, that mask wearing, whatever minimal was happening, is going to evaporate. And so I'm looking at what we're doing. I'm just thinking to myself, what are we thinking? I do not know what our government is thinking right now. This sounds like almost it was a year ago, right? When everyone was saying, oh, well, by July, we'll be back to normal. And we were coping with this because just in 6-week segments, and everything will be fine by summer. And of course, that was nowhere near true. But that's how they were coping with this. And now I don't deny there are so many people, not only in the US, but around the world, who are tired of social distancing. They're tired of wearing masks. They want to get back to normal. But the pandemic has not been beaten yet. And even though we may be doing fairly well at vaccinating most of our population, we are doing that at the expense of more vulnerable and impoverished communities around the world, right? So we are now beginning to vaccinate children, which, again, I think we need to vaccinate everybody, but we're doing it before there are many nations that are still barely even beginning their vaccination process. And in part because nations like the US is literally hoarding vaccinations, not only in storage, but on order and in the pipeline. And so for myself, I am taking a very cautious response. I'm not fully vaccinated. I actually get my second shot today of the Moderna, and so I may be out of commission for the next 2 days. I've heard frequently that the second shot is a doozy, and have seen it in some of my family members, and so I'm actually have cleared my schedule for the next 2 days. And after my shot today, don't have anything on my agenda, just because I've heard the reports that people can be pretty fatigued after the second shot. So I'm kind of preparing for that. But again, it's 2 weeks after that we're fully vaccinated, and we have children who are not 12 yet. And so our family is going to be taking a very cautious approach. We will continue wearing masks wherever we go in public, especially when we go indoors shopping, or we're not eating in restaurants at all. And I am literally going to just be watching, because I am deeply afraid, concerned, that we're going to see a rise in infections going into the summer and possibly even into the fall. It's for whatever reason, and we've seen this time and time again over the past 18 months, whenever we see a drop, governments and local governments begin dropping and lowering their policies, and then the numbers just go back up. And it's like we for whatever reason forget that we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we haven't reached herd immunity. And I personally don't feel like our nation has demonstrated that we are capable of wearing masks based on an honor system, right? We haven't demonstrated that we're capable of doing that. And so I'm very deeply concerned by both what the CDC has stated, as well as by what the Biden administration has been saying. And for myself, we will be continuing to wear masks and continuing to social distance, because when I look at the other numbers, what we're doing currently as a nation doesn't make any sense to me. So anyway, that's that. I just wanted to get that out there, and I wanted to caution people to please make sure you protect the health of yourself, as well as those most vulnerable in your communities, and as well as of the most vulnerable around the globe, right? We need to push our government to make sure that we are remembering that we are citizens of a global community, and we need to be concerned and make sure that vaccinations are reaching all of the globe, not just the people who can afford it. The second thing I want to talk about is what's going on in Israel and in Palestine, especially. If you've been watching the news, you'll know that over the weekend especially, there have been a lot of It's a war, almost, essentially. Hundreds have been killed, dozens of children, and the violence, even one of the buildings in Gaza that was bombed over the weekend housed media outlets like AP. And the offensive, especially from the Israeli military, is at a very high level, as well as the bombs coming from Hamas towards Israel. And first of all, I want to call for peace. I want to state that there is absolutely injustice going on there. Absolutely, things need to be addressed. But I want to call for peace from both the Israeli military as well as from Hamas. And I want to encourage both sides to stop bombing one another. And I second want to state that we have to remember what's at the root of this conflict. And especially if you've listened to the Biden administration over the weekend, President Biden has consistently talked about the right Israel has to defend itself. And yet there's been increasing calls from especially progressives in the US to stand with Palestine. And I want to address actually both of those things. And first, we have to remember at the root of this current round of conflict is both the human rights issues for the Palestinian people as well as land, right? Israel was in the process of evicting Palestinian families from East Jerusalem and allowing Israeli settlers to move into those lands. That was what some of the protest was about, as well as the heavy-handed policing. And many Palestinians just crying out, protesting that they're tired of being treated as second-class citizens. And even we see this, right? Even right in that same area in Palestine, where Israel is being held up as a model for vaccinating their own people, and yet Palestine, which is essentially an occupied territory of Israel, has some of the lowest numbers of vaccinations. And Israel is vaccinating their own people to the neglect of the Palestinian people. And again, the Palestinians are saying, we're tired of being treated as second-class citizens. And there's been a lot of push from even Democrats in Congress to try and get the Biden administration to stand more boldly with Israel. And I want to remind you, again, especially Democrats, I'm bewildered by you because you keep acting like Joe Biden didn't make all these promises that he was not going to do these sorts of things when he was running, right? He made it very clear how colonial he was. He made it very clear where he stood on issues about systemic racism and oppression. He did not hide those things at all. And now you protest him like you're going to somehow persuade him. Now that he's in power, you're like, oh, well, now we can get him to do these things. And this makes no sense to me, Democrats. I don't know why you thought this. Joe Biden was crystal clear. If you want to understand where he stands on these issues, look at his stance towards Native peoples. Now, the way that Joe Biden was sold to the American people, and even to communities of color, was that he was not Trump. And that, in fact, that was his whole campaign, which is, I'm not Trump. That was what he promised, and his promise to return us to the status quo. And so I've talked about this before, but I want to go into this again, right? It was a year ago, a little over a year ago, that Donald Trump disestablished the reservation for the Mashpee Wampanoag. And this was a reservation that the Obama-Biden administration had established towards the end of their administration. And President Trump, going into the pandemic, just after the pandemic broke out, it was in March or April, disestablished that reservation. And there was a large outcry around the nation about how unjust this was. And Joe Biden responded to that as well. I shared this link before, and I'm going to share it one more time. He responded, and I wrote an op-ed regarding his response. And I'm putting this in the comment section right now. The op-ed I wrote titled, "Trump and Biden are peddling nostalgia, and that's a problem." And I was critiquing what Joe Biden was saying about Trump, and he was calling out Trump for being unjust and saying that he was not treating the Mashpee Wampanoag fairly. And he reminded the world, the nation, how he and President Obama had established this reservation. And then after stating those things, he made a statement where he said to Native peoples, he said to us, one of the most important roles that the federal government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nationship relationship with Native peoples is taking land into trust on behalf of tribes. It is critical for tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Again, that doesn't shock most people because you're used to Native nations being treated as second-class citizens, much like the Palestinians are, even the Bedouins, which are even in a worse fate than the Palestinians. But his words don't make any sense, right? He absolutely is treating us as second-class citizens. One of the most important roles the federal government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nationship relationship is taking land into trust on behalf of tribes. Really? So for those of you who don't know, the reason, the way the doctrine of discovery is played out today is Native nations don't own our lands. Our lands are held in trust for us by the doctrine of discovery. Our lands are held in trust for us by the federal government. And this is based on the doctrine of discovery that states we're savages and we don't have rights to the land. And so Joe Biden he's not challenging. So it was that domestic dependent relationship, that doctrine of discovery understanding of land titles, which is what gave President Trump the authority to disestablish the reservation. But Joe Biden here is not saying he's going to change that. He's merely saying he will be a better landlord. He says, I still have the right to kick you out. I just won't do it, at least not as publicly and as such an inopportune time as this. But I'm still going to even ask you to put your lands in trust with me, with the federal government. He's still reinforcing and enhancing and perpetuating that domestic dependent relationship between Native nations and the federal government. Imagine if he said this to any other nation. Imagine if we sent one of our ambassadors to the UK and said to the British people, one of the most important roles the US government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nationship relationship with Great Britain is taking lands into trust on behalf of the British people. This is critical for British sovereignty and self-determination, right? At least that would be laughable. At worst, it would be a declaration of war. We would never say that. You would only say that to people who you consider to be second-class citizens. So Joe Biden, he said this during the campaign. He made it very clear how he saw the U.S. government's relationship with Native nations. And so if you think he is going to challenge Israel in their domestic dependent oppression of the Palestinian people or the Bedouins, you're dreaming. He's not going to do that. And on top of that, right, even on top of Biden, if you remember last summer, the McGirt case, which again, this was McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma, arguing that is the whole eastern half of Oklahoma reservation land or not. And the case was a ruling in favor of McGirt, in favor of the Creek Nation. But in the ruling, right, Neil Gorsuch wrote in the opinion by the Supreme Court, he said, yes, the state doesn't have the right to disestablish reservation lands, and yes, the courts don't have the right to disestablish reservation lands, but he said to determine whether a tribe continues to hold a reservation, there is only one place we may look, and that's the acts of Congress. And this court, the Supreme Court, long ago held that the legislature wields significant constitutional authority when it comes to tribal relations, possessing even the authority to breach its own promises and treaties. He went on to write that history shows that Congress knows how to withdraw a reservation when it can muster the will. Sometimes legislation has provided an explicit reference to cession or an unconditional commitment to compensate the Indian tribe for its lands. Congress has directed that tribal lands shall be restored to the public domain. Whatever they want to say, they can say whenever they can muster the will. And it was in 2005, right, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote an opinion referencing by name the doctrine of discovery, and stating that the Oneida Indian Nation could not rekindle embers of sovereignty that had long ago grown cold, after she made the same dehumanizing, savage, you're savages argument that John Marshall made in 1823. So it's not just Biden. It's the Supreme Court. It's Donald Trump. It's even the progressive left that has no intention of changing this domestic dependent, oppressive relationship that diminishes the agency, and I would argue even the humanity, of Native peoples. And so one of the things I tweeted over the weekend is I said, I'm glad to see so many in the US stand with Palestine, but I can't help but wonder how many of those same Americans can even name the Native nation that US presidents like Abraham Lincoln ethnically cleansed from the lands where they are living today. Right? Most people can't even name the name of the Native tribe, the Native nation that was genocidally removed from the lands so their houses could be built, so their cities could be established, so their states could be founded. And so we're decrying, we're saying we're going to stand with Palestine, but we've done nothing to address the injustices on the lands where we live today. So we have no integrity. This is why, in its current form, the US is incapable of negotiating peace between Israel and Palestine. And as loud as the progressive Democrats in Congress are going to scream, ask them about the titles to the land that they own where their house sits. Ask them what they've done to bring about justice with the Native nations within our own country in a real and direct way. Most of them don't even do land acknowledgments. So again, this is the challenge we're facing, is that the US has no integrity. Now, people are saying, well, Joe Biden's different. Look, he has an African-American vice president. He's even nominated someone like Deb Haaland to become the Secretary of the Interior. But they still serve at the pleasure of Joe Biden. And Joe Biden has made it crystal clear. In fact, we're seeing, right, Vice President Harris walk back a lot of the things that she campaigned on when she was running, so she can be in line, whether it's on immigration or even on Israel-Palestine, so that she can be in line with the Biden administration. If you listen to Deb Harris's confirmation hearings, where she was challenged by Republican senators about her stances that she brought up when she was running for Congress, right? She went to Standing Rock. She was against fracking. She said oil should stay in the ground. And she was challenged by Republican senators if she was going to hold those beliefs still, or if she was going to fall in line with the Biden administration's views. And she continually stated that she would fall in line with the Biden administration's views. Joe Biden wants to look progressive without actually being progressive. He's not going to change. He's been in politics for his entire life, his entire professional life. He owes he's been in that mess for so long. He has no ability to do what is absolutely right. He raised over $1 billion by his committee last year. Do you know how many promises, how many things you have to promise? I won't say this, I won't jump this, I won't affect that, to raise that kind of money. And that's not even talking about the PAC money and all the other promises to the billionaires he had to make. Joe Biden is not going to address these things, at least not in any real meaningful way. He will return us to the status quo. He will say Israel has a right to defend itself, and the Palestinians have to learn how to live as second-class citizens. But he's not going to enact real change, and that's a shame. That's a shame. And so if you're going to be tweeting or standing up and saying you stand with Palestine, that's good. But I want to challenge you to look at what are you doing about the land and the genocide and the ethnic cleansing that happened here, where your own house sits, the neighborhood that you live in. Are you even aware of the name of the native nation that was ethnically cleansed from those lands? Most likely you're not. So I am deeply disturbed by what's going on in the Middle East right now. I am horrified to see the death and the violence. Peace needs to be negotiated. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is not capable of doing that, at least not in a just manner. We need to do better. We need to do better, my relatives. So those are some of the thoughts I have at the moment about what's going on. I am not sure. Well, yeah. So I will continue to monitor what's being said here. Unfortunately, I don't know what the solution is at this moment, right? Because the people that we've elected have promised they're not going to change these things. The people we celebrated coming into office made it very clear they're not going to address these things at a systemic level. So I'm hesitant to even protest. I'm deeply concerned about the loss of life. I'm deeply concerned about the ongoing oppression. I'm deeply concerned about this war that's breaking out. But Joe Biden promised the status quo, and this is the status quo. And so we need to do better. We need to do better. I hope that you have a good day, my relatives. I hope that you're able to maintain sanity in the midst of all of this. I hope that you're able to remember that we need to continue to walk in beauty, and we must learn how to walk in beauty together. I didn't watch the sunrise this morning because I'm trying to catch up on some sleep, and so I slept in this morning a little bit. But depending on how I feel tomorrow, I'm going to try and go out and watch the sunrise again tomorrow. And we'll continue to work towards moving things in the right direction every day. And right now, the most work I think I can do is to continue to educate, continue to change the paradigm, continue to help us understand what it is we actually stand for as a nation and what are the things we need to change. We can't, I don't know how to make this change today. I don't know how to do that, but we can obviously work for change in the future. We can work for change in the years to come. And that's what I'm setting my sights on. So I can't help my relatives walk in beauty, and then we learn how to walk in beauty together. Akehat and Hakonet.